Before we dive into today's terrifying tale, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe to my channel. Don't forget to click the bell icon so you never miss a spine-chilling story. Let's get into it. The anesthesia that didn't work.
When they wheeled me into the operating room, I told myself everything would be fine. Routine surgery, they said. Just a hernia repair. Nothing major. People did this sort of thing all the time, right? But as I lay there under the blinding white light, with the sterile smell of antiseptic filling my nostrils, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't quite right. Maybe it was the anesthesiologist's rushed demeanor or the way the surgeon avoided making eye contact. I chalked it up to nerves, my own nerves, and tried to focus on the rhythmic beeping of the monitors. "All right, Ethan," the anesthesiologist said with a practiced calm. "This will feel like a pinch. Then you'll drift off. Count back from 10 for me." I felt the cold sting of the 4 as the sedative coursed into my arm. My lips moved automatically. 10, 9, 8. My voice slurred, and the room tilted slightly. The ceiling lights blurred into halos. And then, nothing. Nothing but darkness. But I wasn't gone. I was still there. At first, I thought it was normal, some halfway state before the drugs fully kicked in. But the darkness wasn't peaceful. It was heavy, suffocating. I could hear voices, faint at first, but growing clearer. "Scalpel," someone said. "Got it," another replied. I tried to open my eyes, to let them know I was still awake, but my body wouldn't respond. My chest tightened as I realized I couldn't move, couldn't speak, couldn't even twitch a finger. "Vitals are stable," said a third voice. I wanted to scream. "I'm awake. Stop. Don't touch me," but nothing came out. Inside, I was thrashing, panicking, but outwardly, I was a mannequin, lifeless on the table. Then I felt it. A dull pressure, low in my abdomen. Not pain exactly, but the unmistakable sensation of something being done to my body. They had started the surgery. I tried again to scream, to will my arms to move, to shake my head. Anything to make them see I wasn't under. But it was useless. I was trapped in my own body, a prisoner to their knives and tools. The voices continued around me, calm and clinical. They were chatting about weekend plans, some sports game, like it was any other day. My silent terror grew louder in my head, a roar of panic that no one could hear. And then their tone shifted. "Did you hear about the patient last month?" one of them said, lowering his voice. I felt my heart rate spike. Was he talking about me? "The one from Ward C," another replied. "Yeah. Poor bastard. Should have kept his mouth shut." They chuckled softly. My panic sharpened into dread. What the hell were they talking about? "Enough," a third voice said, sterner than the others. "Focus. This one doesn't need to know anything." I couldn't make sense of it. Were they talking about me? What didn't I need to know? My mind raced, desperate for answers, desperate for a way out of this waking nightmare. And then I felt it again, the pressure in my abdomen, sharper now. My world shrank to that sensation, the cold voices above me, and the inescapable realization that I was utterly powerless. The first cut wasn't sharp. It was more of a pulling, a dragging sensation deep in my gut, like someone tugging at the core of my being. I couldn't feel the pain the way I knew I should, but the sensation was unbearable in its own way, an awareness of something happening to me that I couldn't stop. I could hear the snip of scissors, the scrape of metal against bone, the wet sound of tissue being moved aside. Inside, I was screaming. "Hold that steady," one of the surgeons said, his voice casual, almost bored. "Got it," another replied. Their tones infuriated me. How could they sound so calm when I was trapped here, fully conscious and helpless? I tried again to move, to do anything to make them notice. But my body refused to obey, lying limp and compliant on the cold table. And then they started talking again, and this time their words cut deeper than the scalpel ever could. "So, did you hear what they decided about the old man?" one of them asked. His voice had dropped slightly, as though he didn't want others to hear. "What old man?" "The one who wouldn't shut up. The whistleblower." "Oh, him," another replied, a note of amusement in her voice. "Yeah, I heard. Poor bastard didn't make it out of the building." There was a pause, then quiet laughter. The panic in my chest turned icy. I didn't know who they were talking about, but the way they said it, so casual, so nonchalant, made my skin crawl. "They're not putting him in the report, are they?" "Of course not. Same as always. He was transferred, if you know what I mean." Another laugh, this one darker. I wanted to scream again, to tell them I could hear everything, that I knew their secret. But then it hit me, they thought I was completely under. They didn't know I was awake. And if they didn't know, what would they do if they found out? "Careful," one of them said sharply, pulling me from my spiraling thoughts. "You don't want to nick the wrong thing." "Relax," the other replied. "You think he's going to notice?" I wanted to shout, "I notice! I know!" But the words stayed trapped in my head. The conversation shifted back to the procedure, the sterile banter of professionals at work. But every so often, they dropped another remark, something darker, something sinister. "Ward C's been busy lately," one of them said. "Yeah. They're running out of room down there." "They'll make room," came the reply, flat and emotionless. I didn't know what Ward C was, but I didn't need details to feel the weight of their words. It wasn't just a part of the hospital. It was something else entirely, something wrong. My mind raced, trying to piece together what I was hearing. A patient who didn't make it out. A secret ward. A cover-up. The implications swirled around me, growing heavier with every second I spent lying there, exposed and vulnerable. Then, just as I thought I couldn't take any more, I saw something, or thought I did. From the corner of my eye, beyond the blur of faces and bright lights, I noticed a shadow. It was tall and narrow, too precise to be a trick of the light, and it moved, shifting just out of my view. My heart pounded in my chest, the monitor beside me betraying my terror. "Hey," one of the surgeons said, his tone suddenly sharp. "Look at his vitals. What's going on?" The others glanced at the monitor, murmuring to each other. I could feel their eyes on me, could feel their curiosity prickling my skin. But all I could think about was that shadow, and the fact that I wasn't alone in this room. I couldn't shake the shadow I'd seen. It wasn't just a trick of my mind. I knew that now. Even though I couldn't turn my head or focus my eyes, I could sense it, hovering at the edge of the room. Watching. The surgeons didn't acknowledge it directly, but their behavior changed. They worked faster, their voices sharper, the casual banter replaced by terse instructions. "Hold that steady," the lead surgeon snapped. "Almost done," another replied, though her voice wavered slightly. They knew it was there. They could feel it too. "What's the hold-up?" The anesthesiologist barked from behind me, frustration in his voice. "Nothing," the lead surgeon said quickly. "Just focus on keeping him stable." Stable. That word felt like a cruel joke. I wasn't stable. I was screaming inside, desperate for them to stop, to end this nightmare. But I couldn't make a sound. Then one of them said something that froze my blood. "We need to finish this before they check in." "Relax," the anesthesiologist replied. "We've got time. They won't come up here unless—" A loud thud interrupted him. It wasn't from the instruments or the machines. It came from the corner of the room where the shadow had been. The room went silent. For a moment, the only sound was the beeping of my heart monitor, which had started to race again. "Damn it," one of the surgeons muttered under his breath. "It's too soon." The lead surgeon leaned in closer, his voice low and urgent. "Just keep going. They can't do anything unless we stop." The shadow shifted again, and I felt a cold dread settle over me. It wasn't just an observer. It was something else, something that didn't belong in this world. "Ward C is full," the lead surgeon said, barely audible now. "We've already sent 2 down there today. If they think we're falling behind," he trailed off, but the unspoken threat hung in the air. I wanted to cry, to beg them to let me go, to tell them I didn't care what I'd heard, that I wouldn't tell anyone. But I couldn't move. I couldn't do anything. The conversation continued, their words hitting me like punches to the chest. "They've been asking for fresh subjects," one of them said. "Not this one," the lead surgeon replied sharply. "He's not a candidate." I didn't know whether to feel relief or terror at those words. Not a candidate for what? Another thud echoed in the room, louder this time. I could feel the vibration through the table. The shadow grew darker, more defined, as though it was stepping closer. "Damn it," the anesthesiologist hissed. "It's already here." The shadow seemed to stretch, its form twisting unnaturally. My peripheral vision caught glimpses of something long and sinewy, with too many angles to make sense. The air around it grew colder, and I swore I could hear a faint, distorted whisper, like wind howling through a broken window. "Finish the procedure," the lead surgeon ordered. His voice was shaking now, but his hands kept working. "Don't stop. If we stop, it takes one of us." I realized then that the shadow wasn't there for me. It was there for them. And yet, as much as I wanted to believe I was safe, I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever it was, it had already marked me too. The shadow lingered in the corner, shifting and twisting like smoke trapped in a jar. It didn't follow the laws of the physical world. Its presence defied logic, making the air feel thick and heavy. Every second it remained, the temperature in the room seemed to drop further, the chill sinking into my bones. The surgeons tried to ignore it, but I could hear the tension in their voices. "Almost done," the lead surgeon said through gritted teeth. His hands moved faster now, the metallic clink of instruments filling the silence. "Vitals are spiking," the anesthesiologist said. "No kidding," someone muttered. But I wasn't sure if it was the surgery or the shadow that had my heart racing. I couldn't take my eyes off it. Not that I had a choice. Even though I couldn't fully see it, I could feel it watching me. And then it moved. Slowly, deliberately, it stretched out toward the table, its edges curling like black tendrils of smoke. It wasn't touching me, but it felt close, too close. My skin prickled as though ice was pressing against it. "Keep going," the lead surgeon barked, his voice cracking. But the shadow didn't stop. It grew darker, more defined, until it wasn't just a shadow anymore. I could see shapes, hands, claws, something sharp and unnatural, reaching toward me. I tried to scream, to plead, to beg them to stop whatever this was. But I couldn't. My body was still a prison, my voice silent. "Don't let it touch him," one of the surgeons whispered. "What do you think I'm doing?" the lead surgeon snapped. "Ward C can take it back," another said, panic creeping into her voice. "No," the lead surgeon shot back. "If it doesn't finish here, it follows us out. We all know the rules." The rules. My mind latched onto those words. What rules? What had they done to summon this thing? The shadow reached the edge of the table, its tendrils hovering just above my chest. I could feel it, not physically, but deep in my mind. It wasn't just watching me, it was inside me, crawling through my thoughts, prying into every corner of my fear. Then I heard it. A voice. Low and guttural, layered with something not human. "Marked," it whispered. The word echoed in my skull, louder than the beeping monitors, louder than the frantic voices of the surgeons. "No," the lead surgeon hissed. "Not him. Take one of us. He's not part of this." The shadow paused. The room fell silent, the tension so thick it was suffocating. And then, without warning, it recoiled, snapping back into the corner like a rubber band. The surgeons let out a collective breath, but it was short-lived. "Vitals dropping," the anesthesiologist said. "Stabilize him," the lead surgeon barked. But I didn't care about my vitals anymore. All I could think about was that word. Marked. The shadow wasn't gone. I could feel it lingering, waiting. It had chosen me, and I had no idea what that meant. But deep down, I knew this wasn't over. When the shadow finally disappeared, the room fell into an uneasy silence. The chill in the air lingered, and I could feel the tension radiating from the surgeons. Their hands moved with mechanical precision, but their faces, what little I could see of them, were pale, their eyes darting nervously toward the corner where the shadow had been. "It's done," the lead surgeon finally said, his voice low and shaken. "Close him up," someone muttered. The instruments clinked together, and I felt the faint tug of sutures being tightened. But I didn't care about the surgery anymore. My mind was consumed by the shadow, by the word it had whispered to me. Marked. What did it mean? Why me? I wanted to cry out, to demand answers, but I was still trapped, paralyzed by the anesthetic. My body was a shell, and my thoughts were the only thing keeping me from spiraling into madness. As they finished, their conversation resumed, but it was quieter now, more guarded. "We need to report this," one of them said hesitantly. "Are you insane?" The lead surgeon snapped. "We report this, and it's our names on the list." "What about him?" the anesthesiologist asked, nodding toward me. "He doesn't know anything," the lead replied. "By the time he wakes up, he'll forget it all. The drugs will wipe it clean." But I wouldn't forget. I knew that with absolute certainty. The lead surgeon leaned over me, his face so close I could see the sweat beading on his forehead. His eyes were sharp, almost desperate. "If he does remember," he said, "he won't live long enough to tell anyone." I wanted to scream, to fight, but I was helpless as they wheeled me out of the operating room. The ceiling tiles blurred as they passed, and the cold, sterile air felt like a shroud wrapping around me. When I woke up in recovery, the first thing I noticed was the silence. No voices, no footsteps, just the faint hum of the machines around me. I tried to move, and to my relief, my body finally obeyed. My fingers twitched, my head turned, and for the first time in what felt like hours, I could breathe on my own. But something was wrong. My chest felt heavy, not from the surgery, but from something deeper. I looked down and saw it, a faint, dark mark etched into my skin just below the incision site. It wasn't from the surgery. It was something else, something unnatural. Panic surged through me. I pressed the call button for the nurse, but no one came. The hum of the machines grew louder, almost deafening, as if they were mocking me. Then I heard it again. That voice. Marked, it whispered, the sound reverberating through the empty room. I turned my head toward the door, but it was closed. The lights flickered, and in the reflection of the monitor, I saw it, the shadow. It hadn't left. It never left. My chest tightened as I realized the truth. Whatever had happened in that operating room, whatever deal the surgeons had struck, it wasn't over. I wasn't free. I was marked. And it was only a matter of time before it came back for me.
The patient who never left.
Night shifts have a way of warping time. The hours stretch endlessly, and the silence becomes almost oppressive, broken only by the occasional beep of a heart monitor or the soft shuffle of a nurse's shoes on the tile floor. I had been working at Chicago General for only a few months, still getting used to the eerie calm that settled over the hospital after midnight. It was nothing like the chaotic, bustling energy of the daytime. At night, the halls seemed alive in a different way, as though the building itself were breathing. There was one area I always avoided during my rounds, the old surgical wing on the 3rd floor. It had been shut down years ago, replaced by a newer, state-of-the-art suite on another level. The other nurses whispered about it, trading stories of strange noises and unexplained happenings. I never gave the rumors much thought. Hospitals are inherently creepy, especially at night, but something about that wing made my skin crawl. I was halfway through my shift when I first heard it. A faint, rhythmic sound, like a soft tapping or muffled knocking. It was subtle at first, barely distinguishable from the ambient hum of the building. I paused in the hallway, holding my breath, straining to identify the source. The sound seemed to be coming from the direction of the old surgical wing. I shook my head, trying to brush it off. Probably just the HVAC system acting up, I told myself. I continued my rounds, checking vitals and restocking supplies, but the noise stayed with me, growing louder in my mind even when I wasn't hearing it. By the time I finished my duties, curiosity had taken hold. Against my better judgment, I found myself walking toward the abandoned wing. My footsteps echoed unnervingly in the empty hallway as I approached the heavy double doors leading to the old operating rooms. A faded sign read, Surgical Suite 300 to 315, the letters chipped and worn. The sound was clearer now, soft and insistent, like someone tapping their fingers on a hard surface. My stomach tightened as I reached for the door handle. It was cold to the touch, colder than it should have been. I hesitated for a moment, every instinct screaming at me to turn back, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something, or someone, was waiting for me on the other side. The door creaked open, revealing a dimly lit hallway that smelled of antiseptic and dust. The air was heavy, almost suffocating, and my flashlight's beam seemed swallowed by the darkness ahead. I walked slowly, my shoes squeaking against the worn linoleum floor, my pulse pounding in my ears. Room 313. That was where the noise was coming from. The door was slightly ajar, a faint light flickering inside. My breath hitched. This part of the hospital wasn't supposed to have power. "Hello," I called out, my voice shaky and weak. No answer. I pushed the door open further, and that's when I saw it. A figure lay on the operating table in the center of the room. A man, thin and pale, his hospital gown stained with what looked like dried blood. His chest rose and fell shallowly, and his head turned toward me. His eyes, sunken and glassy, locked onto mine. "Help me," he rasped. My blood turned to ice. I froze, unable to move or speak. Every rational part of my mind screamed that this was impossible. This room had been out of use for years. "Please," he whispered again, his voice filled with desperation. I wanted to run, but my feet refused to obey. Instead, I stepped closer, drawn to him despite the overwhelming fear gripping me. The air around him felt colder, heavier, as if the room itself was holding its breath. "Who are you?" I managed to choke out. He didn't answer. He just stared at me, his lips trembling as he struggled to speak. And then I noticed something: the surgical instruments beside him. They were spotless, gleaming under the flickering light. Too clean, as though they'd just been sterilized. That's when I knew something was terribly, horribly wrong. I stood there, frozen, my mind racing in 1,000 different directions. The man on the table was so lifeless, yet so real. His pale skin was almost translucent, the veins visible just beneath the surface. The blood-stained gown clung to his thin frame, and there was something about his presence that felt wrong. His eyes, those hollow, unblinking eyes, never left mine. It felt like he could see straight into my soul, and it made my stomach twist. "Help me," he whispered again, his voice barely audible, as if the words were a struggle for him to form. I took a step forward, my legs shaking beneath me. My brain screamed at me to run, to get away from that room, but my body refused to move. It was as if something was holding me there, forcing me to listen. Who are you?" I asked, my voice trembling more than I intended. The man's lips quivered, and for a moment I thought he might collapse into unconsciousness. But then he managed to speak again, his words slow, deliberate. I shouldn't be here. I never should have. I never left." The words didn't make sense. How could he not have left? This room had been sealed off for years. No patients had been here for ages. "Please," he begged, his voice hoarse and pained. "Help me. They left me." I wanted to ask him who had left him, what had happened to him, but every time I tried to form a question, my throat felt tight, as though the air itself was thick with a pressure I couldn't escape. I was so terrified, but there was something else, something that was driving me to stay, to understand what was happening. His hand twitched, just slightly, and I noticed something strange. There were no 4 lines hooked up to him. No heart monitor beeping. No machines keeping him alive. He was just lying there, motionless, except for the faint rise and fall of his chest. His entire existence felt impossible. "Who are you?" I asked again, a little more urgently this time, but the man didn't respond. Instead, his gaze shifted to the corner of the room, his eyes widening as if he had seen something I couldn't. I followed his gaze, my heart racing. There was nothing there. No shadow, no figure, just the sterile, empty space of the abandoned surgical room. "Do you hear it?" he asked suddenly, his voice more frantic now. I blinked, confused. "Hear what?" "The whispers," he said, almost frantically. "They won't stop. They never stop." I froze. The whispers. I hadn't heard them before, not consciously, but now that he mentioned it, the air in the room seemed to hum with something just out of reach. A low murmur, like voices carried on the wind, just beyond the threshold of hearing. I took another step toward him, despite every bone in my body telling me to turn and run. I had to know. Who did this to you? I whispered, my voice barely audible. The man's eyes flickered, and for a moment, it seemed like he might tell me something important. But then he blinked, and his gaze seemed to cloud over, a distant hollow look overtaking him. They did this to me, he mumbled, barely coherent. The doctors, the surgery, they left me here. My blood ran cold. The words didn't make sense. This man was dead. He had to be. There was no other explanation. But if he was dead, then how was he here? How was he talking to me? I felt my knees weaken, and I had to brace myself against the cold metal table. It seemed to vibrate beneath my touch, as though it too were alive, as though it had witnessed something it couldn't forget. Before I could ask him anything more, the door behind me slammed shut, cutting off my ability to breathe. My heart leapt in my chest, and I whirled around to find the room bathed in a cold, sickly glow. The whispers were louder now, more distinct. A chorus of voices, murmurs of panic and fear. It wasn't just one voice anymore. It was a cacophony, swirling around me, suffocating me. And then, a voice, clearer than the rest, sounded in my ear. "Get out of here." I spun around, expecting to see someone standing behind me, but there was no one there. The man on the table stared at me with that same hollow gaze. His lips didn't move, but I heard his voice again, as clear as day. "Don't listen to them. Leave this room." Something inside me snapped. This wasn't right. This wasn't a normal patient. This wasn't even a normal room. I could feel it, feel the walls pressing in on me, as if the room itself were alive, feeding off of my fear. I couldn't take it anymore. I turned to leave, but as I did, I felt something grab my wrist. Cold, clammy fingers that dug into my skin with a strength I couldn't explain. "Help me," the patient's voice pleaded one last time, but this time it wasn't just his voice. It was the voices of everyone who had ever been in that room. The countless souls trapped here, begging for release. I pulled away, my heart racing, and bolted for the door. It was locked. I tried again. Nothing. My breath was shallow, my palms slick with sweat. I was trapped. That's when I heard it, the sound of footsteps behind me, slow and deliberate. They were coming closer. I couldn't breathe. My chest was tight, the air thick with fear, and I could feel the cold sweat creeping down my back. I hammered at the door again, desperate. My hands were shaking so violently that I could barely grip the handle. The footsteps behind me, slow, methodical, like someone walking closer and closer, sent chills down my spine. I tried to scream, to call for help, but no sound came out. My throat was dry, constricted as if something invisible was choking me. I had to get out of there. I had to. The door wouldn't open. The room felt smaller, tighter, as if the walls were closing in around me. The whispers from earlier grew louder, more insistent, until they became a constant buzz in my ears, making my thoughts muddled. It was as if the room itself was alive, the voices swirling around, twisting through the air. And then I saw it. A shadow, darker than the rest of the darkness around me, moved in the corner of my vision. I whipped my head toward it, my heart racing, but nothing was there. Just the eerie stillness of the room. But I could feel it. I could feel something watching me. Something was standing in that corner, just waiting. I turned back to the door. No use. I pounded on it again, desperate, my breath ragged. "Please, please let me out." Then, a soft voice, barely audible but unmistakably there, came from the corner. "Why won't you help him?" I froze. It wasn't the man on the table. His voice had been weak, almost non-existent. This was different. The voice was smooth, calm, almost inviting. It sounded like it was coming from inside my head. "Who's there?" I gasped, my voice breaking. The air around me grew even colder, the temperature dropping so suddenly that my teeth began to chatter. The whispers swirled into a crescendo. It was as if the very fabric of the room was pressing against me, suffocating me with its darkness. I turned, searching for the source of the voice, but it felt like it was coming from everywhere. "Help him," the voice urged again, but this time it was closer. Too close. I felt a hand on my shoulder, icy cold, like death itself had reached out to claim me. I spun around, ready to confront whatever it was, but there was no one there. Nothing but the shadows. But I could feel them, watching me dash. The whispers grew louder, more frantic. I couldn't escape them. Then I heard it. The sound of something moving across the floor behind me. A soft shuffle, like bare feet on cold tile. I dared not look, but my body betrayed me, forcing me to glance over my shoulder. The patient, the man on the table, was no longer lying still. He was standing. His pale, lifeless form was shuffling toward me, dragging his feet as if his limbs weren't quite his own. His head lolled to one side, his eyes wide and unblinking, fixed on me. I screamed, dash. My voice came out in a strangled, high-pitched wail, but it was drowned by the noise around me. The whispers were now full-blown voices. People, patients, doctors, screaming, begging, crying. All of them together, in a cacophony of despair. I stumbled back, my knees giving out, but the shadow, the thing that had been standing in the corner, was in front of me now, too. I was trapped. The man, no, the thing that looked like him, was only inches away, its breath icy on my face. "Why didn't you save me?" Dash, the words came from his lips, but they didn't sound like him. They were wrong, Dash. Twisted. His mouth moved, but the voice was not his. It was deeper, filled with malice. "Help me," he whispered, his voice breaking through the cacophony, but it wasn't a plea anymore. It was an order. I couldn't move. I couldn't speak. I felt a coldness settle in my bones, a suffocating weight that pressed down on my chest. I knew in that moment that this wasn't just a man. He wasn't just a patient. He was something other, Dash. Something that had never left that room, never left this place. I reached out, trembling, my hand brushing against his, expecting ice. But instead, I felt warmth, a sickening warmth that made my skin crawl. It wasn't real. None of this was real. I yanked my hand away, my heart pounding in my chest. The thing that had been the man was now smiling at me, an unnatural grin stretching across its face, as though it took pleasure in my terror. "I told you," it said, its voice a low rasp. "You should have helped me." The room spun. The whispers grew into shrieks of horror. I felt my pulse racing, my body shaking with panic. I had to leave. I had to escape. But the door wouldn't budge. Suddenly, I felt a sharp pain in my side, a cold, searing pain that shot through me, and I gasped, stumbling. I looked down, my vision blurry, and I saw blood soaking my scrubs. But it wasn't mine. I could barely breathe, could barely think. This wasn't real. It couldn't be. And then I heard the door creak. It opened, slowly, as if it had all the time in the world. A voice came from the darkness beyond. "Leave, Daft." I didn't need to be told twice. I stumbled out of that room like a man possessed, my body moving without my mind. My legs barely held me up, and my breath came in frantic gasps. I had to get out. I had to escape the suffocating grip of that place. But no matter how fast I moved, it felt like the walls were closing in on me. The hallway was silent now, but the echoes of what I had seen, what I had heard still rang in my head. I couldn't shake the image of that patient. No, that thing. His hollow eyes staring into mine, his cold breath on my skin. It was like a nightmare that wouldn't end. My hand found the railing as I moved down the hall, but I couldn't stop shaking. Every step felt like a battle. The whispers, the shadows, they were still there, lurking at the edge of my mind. I felt like something was following me, closing in on me. I couldn't tell if it was my own fear playing tricks on me or if something in that place wanted me to feel like this. But I couldn't stop. I reached the elevator, hands trembling as I pressed the button. The seconds stretched into an eternity as I waited for the doors to open. It felt like the hospital itself was holding its breath, waiting to see if I'd escape. The ding of the elevator was like a gunshot, loud in the silence. I stepped inside, barely able to hold it together. The door slid shut with a soft whoosh, and I exhaled, feeling the weight of the night crushing me. I was so close. I just had to make it out of here. But as the elevator descended, a chill ran down my spine. Something was wrong. The lights flickered. Once, twice. The air in the elevator grew heavier, and I suddenly felt like I couldn't breathe. The patient's face I closed my eyes, trying to push the image away, but it was impossible. His face was burned into my memory, those eyes staring at me, accusing me. I hadn't helped him. I hadn't even thought to help him. I had just run Had I? The elevator jolted to a stop, sending me stumbling forward. I reached for the door, heart pounding, only to find it didn't open. I pressed the button repeatedly, but it was useless. The elevator wasn't going anywhere. And then I heard it. A soft, familiar sound, the slow shuffle of feet on the floor, moving toward me. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. My mind screamed for me to turn around, to do anything but I couldn't. I couldn't move. The air felt thick, suffocating. It was the same feeling I'd had in that room, trapped, cornered, like something was closing in on me. I heard the sound of something tapping on the metal walls of the elevator, so faint it could have been a figment of my imagination. But then it came again, louder, closer. A knock. Abe clinked like fingernails tapping against the metal. And the shuffling grew louder too, closer. My heart pounded against my ribs like a drum. I opened my mouth to scream, but no sound came out. The door finally slid open. I don't know how long it had been since the elevator had stopped. Minutes? Hours? But there was no one there. No one visible. But I felt it. I stepped out of the elevator, my body moving without thought, compelled by some force I couldn't understand. The hallway was eerily quiet, no sign of life anywhere. The lights flickered once again. The hallway stretched out before me, long and narrow. And then I saw it. The dark shape at the far end of the corridor. It was him. The patient. Or whatever it was that had taken his place. He was standing, his eyes locked on me, unmoving, as if waiting for me to approach. His grin was stretched wide across his face. But it wasn't a smile. It was a grin, a twisted, grotesque thing that looked wrong on his face. He was still wearing that same hospital gown, bloodstains long dried and crusted, but now his skin looked even paler. His mouth opened slightly, and I could hear the whisper again, but it wasn't just in my ears. It was in my head. A slow, deliberate whisper. "You should have helped me, Daff." I took a step back, but my body was frozen. I couldn't move. I couldn't scream. I just watched Dash. Watched as the thing that used to be a man took a slow step toward me, its eyes never leaving mine, its face stretching wider with every movement. There was something wrong with the way it walked. The way it moved, like it wasn't used to its own body, like it didn't belong in it anymore. Its steps were jerky, uneven, like an old, malfunctioning machine. And then, the whisper grew louder, more insistent. "Help me, Dash." The voice was all around me, echoing in my skull. I shook my head, tears welling in my eyes. I couldn't help him. I couldn't. I wanted to, but I was terrified. And I knew, that it was too late. I turned and ran. I ran without thinking, without caring where I was going. I just had to get away. I could feel it behind me, following me, the soft shuffle of its steps getting closer, closer. I had to escape, but the hallway, it wasn't ending. It stretched on, the same sterile white walls stretching endlessly into the darkness. My lungs burned with each breath, my feet aching, but I couldn't stop. I ran. And then, as I turned a corner, I crashed into something hard. It was the wall. But it wasn't the wall anymore. It was a door. A door that wasn't there before. And as I reached for the handle, the whisper came again, louder now, as if the thing was screaming in my head. "Don't leave me, Daff." I didn't open the door. I couldn't. But something inside that room opened up. The moment I backed away, the door clicked open on its own, and I knew that this wasn't over. It wasn't going to be over. Not until it got what it wanted. And I couldn't stop it. I don't know how long I've been here. The hours blur together, each minute heavier than the last, like the weight of the entire building is pressing down on me. I haven't dared leave the room since that door opened by itself. I don't even know if it's safe to leave anymore. I'm afraid of what I might find, what might be waiting for me in the hall. But I can't stay here forever. I know I need to face it. Face whatever it is that's hunting me, that won't let me escape. I keep thinking about that room, that table, the one where the patient had been, or at least where something had been. The smell still lingers in the back of my mind, a mix of antiseptic and decay, like something had been festering there for years. I can hear the whispers now. Even with the door closed, even when I try to focus on anything else, they're there. Faint at first, but then louder, like they're coming from the walls themselves. The voice, his voice, it's haunting me. "You left me to die, Daff." I can't shake it. No matter how many times I tell myself that I was just doing my job, that I couldn't have known, I feel like it's my fault. I feel like I should have known. I should have checked, should have done something more. But no, I ran Dash. I turned my back on him and I ran. And now, he's still here. I heard a sound outside the room just now. The unmistakable shuffle of feet. I tried to ignore it, to pretend it was just my mind playing tricks on me. But then the door creaked open, slowly, softly, like it was testing me, waiting to see if I'd react. I didn't move. I couldn't. The whispers got louder. "Come back to me, Dash. It wasn't just in my head anymore. The sound was real. It was coming from the hallway, from the shadows, and I could hear it getting closer, moving toward the door. My heart raced in my chest. I forced myself to breathe, to stay calm, but it was impossible. I couldn't. The thing outside knew I was here. It knew I was alone. It wanted me to come out. What happened to the others? Had anyone else heard the whispers? Had anyone else seen what I saw? I couldn't remember. I didn't know if anyone else had been working when this all started, if anyone had seen him, seen it dash. The door creaked open a little wider. The shadows outside stretched into the room like fingers reaching for me, but I didn't dare step forward. I couldn't. I felt it, something, breathe against the back of my neck. A cold, wet rush of air, like a rotten gust of wind. I turned, eyes wide, my heart thumping in my ears, but there was nothing there. Just the empty, suffocating darkness. I didn't hear the footsteps anymore, but I knew it wasn't gone. It was still out there, watching, waiting. With trembling hands, I reached for the phone in my pocket. My fingers were slick with sweat, and I almost dropped it. I fumbled with the screen, desperate to call for help, to get out of here. But the signal, there was no signal. The screen flickered once, twice, before going dark. Nothing dash. I was completely alone. And then the whispering started again. This time it was louder, louder than ever. I could hear it clear as day. The voice was in my ear, in my head, in the walls. It was everywhere. You can't leave me. I'm still here. Dash. I snapped my head around, my eyes wide with panic. The room seemed to shrink, the walls closing in on me. I could see the shadows shifting, moving, gathering in the corners of the room like they had a life of their own. It's here. I could feel its presence, like an oppressive weight pressing down on me. I couldn't breathe. The air was thick, suffocating. I could hear the steady rhythm of something else now. A faint tapping. It was coming from the table, the same table where the patient had been. The one that wasn't there anymore. Tap, tap. I turned, my body trembling. There, in the corner of the room, the shadows had taken shape. The figure, the patient, or whatever he had become, was standing there, his face no longer human. His eyes were wide, unblinking, and empty. His skin was pale, stretched tight over his bones. His mouth opened, but it wasn't a scream. It was just more whispering. "Help me!" Dash. The words echoed in my skull. I couldn't move. I couldn't scream. I just stared, my body frozen with terror. I don't know how long I stood there, paralyzed, watching as the figure reached out toward me, its fingers twitching like they were reaching for my soul. But the moment its hand brushed against my arm, a searing pain shot through me. I screamed out in agony, but no sound escaped my lips. I felt like I was burning, like something was tearing into me from the inside out. I stumbled back, collapsing to the floor. The room spun around me, the shadows closing in, the whispers overwhelming. "You'll never leave, Daff." I thought I heard a door open. I thought I heard someone call my name. But when I looked, there was nothing. And in that moment, I realized I wasn't going to leave. Not ever. The patient never left Dash. And now, neither would I.
The Ghost Surgeon.
I don't remember much of the accident. I don't remember the sound of the crash or the pain I must have felt. What I remember is waking up in a hospital, my body heavy and aching, my mind disoriented. I had been in a car wreck, they told me. A serious one. And I was lucky to be alive. But I wasn't really awake. Not fully. I was floating somewhere between consciousness and unconsciousness, my body trapped under the weight of anesthesia, unable to move. I was aware of the cold steel of the operating table beneath me, the smell of antiseptic in the air, and the buzzing of machines around me. But nothing seemed right. It felt wrong. The air was too thick, too still. The voices around me sounded distant, muffled, like they were coming from far away. I heard the soft shuffle of feet, the clink of instruments, but none of it felt real. I tried to speak, tried to call out, to let them know I was awake, but nothing came out. My mouth wouldn't move. I was trapped in my own body, unable to do anything but listen. Then I heard them. The surgeons, I assume, though I couldn't see them. Their voices were low, almost inaudible, like they were speaking in code. Is he going to make it? He's a tough one. But we've done this before. This will be fine. I wanted to scream. I wanted to tell them I was awake, that I could hear them. But my voice wouldn't work. I felt a cold sweat form on my forehead, the panic starting to rise in my chest. The voices continued, but there was something off about them. They weren't comforting. They were mechanical, emotionless. One voice, deeper than the others, spoke next. You know what we have to do. We can't stop now. I tried again to move, to scream, to warn them, but I couldn't. I was just a witness in my own body. And then, the sound of a scalpel scraping against metal. It should have been comforting. But it wasn't. It sounded wrong. So wrong. I could feel the coldness of the surgeon's touch as they worked, their hands moving with unnatural precision, like a machine performing a task. There was no warmth, no human presence, just cold, efficient movements. The fear gripped me tighter. I couldn't make sense of what was happening. Was I dreaming? Was I hallucinating? I tried again to scream, to do something, anything, but it was no use. I was nothing but a passenger in my own body, trapped in that sterile room with the cold, lifeless hands that continued their work without a second thought. I wanted to cry, to beg for help, but there was nothing I could do. And then I noticed something chilling. The surgeon, he wasn't speaking. None of them were. The silence was suffocating, broken only by the sound of surgical tools and the soft hum of machines. But it wasn't normal silence. It felt as if they were not just quiet, but intentionally so, like they didn't want me to hear them. The cold, robotic movements continued. They never looked at me, never acknowledged my existence. The silence stretched on, and I began to feel a strange, gnawing suspicion. Something was terribly wrong. Something I couldn't explain. Was I hallucinating this? Or was this real? Was the surgery real? I couldn't tell. But then, as I lay there in that state of helplessness, the voice from earlier, cold and steady, spoke again. He can't know. He must never know. A chill ran down my spine. What did they mean? What secret were they hiding? The room grew darker, colder, the feeling of dread overwhelming me. Something wasn't right, but I was too paralyzed to stop it. The operation seemed to drag on forever. Time had no meaning in that state. I was trapped, suspended in a world between wakefulness and darkness, my mind scrambling to make sense of what was happening. I couldn't see anything, couldn't move. but I could feel every tug, every incision, the coldness of metal instruments against my skin. I don't know how much time passed, but eventually, the sharp sounds of the scalpel and the tools became quieter. The surgeons, or whatever they were, grew still. There was no comfort in that stillness. The coldness in the room seemed to thicken, and the silence stretched, suffocating me. It was like they were waiting for something, or someone. I could hear the slow, steady breath of someone standing over me, but I couldn't see them. I could barely hear anything else, except for the mechanical hum of the machines. The air felt thick, like it was pressing down on me, forcing me to remain frozen, to stay trapped in this nightmare. Then I felt it. Something wrong. The sensation of hands, not gentle or careful, but cold, almost mechanical, moving over me. I couldn't describe it. It wasn't like human touch. It felt like the hands of a machine, numb and precise, as if no warmth or empathy existed in their movements. I had to know. I had to understand what was happening. I tried to move my head, tried to lift my hand, anything, just to confirm that I was still here, still alive, but nothing responded. I was still stuck in my own body, a prisoner of my senses, too aware of everything happening around me, but unable to act on it. And then I heard it. A voice, low and grating, as though it didn't belong to a person. It sounded distant, muffled at first, but it grew clearer. "We've done it. It's done." That voice. It wasn't the same as the others. It wasn't one of the surgeons I had heard before. It was deeper, harsher. I couldn't place it, but it made my stomach turn. Done. What was done? What had they done to me? I wanted to scream. I wanted to beg for answers. But my body wouldn't respond. I was trapped inside this shell of flesh, aware of every detail, but incapable of doing anything about it. "He's awake," another voice said. "We should finish it now. It's the only way. Finish it." My heart hammered in my chest, my mind screaming in terror. What are they talking about? The next voice was quieter, almost a whisper. "He can't know. Not yet. We have to." Then there was a sudden sharp noise, like something was being dragged across metal. The air grew colder. A rush of dread shot through me, filling every corner of my mind. I couldn't see them. I couldn't see anything. But the fear in my chest grew. I wasn't supposed to be awake. I shouldn't have been able to hear them. This was wrong, so wrong. I felt a sharp pull in my chest, a tightening sensation like something was being removed. My breath quickened. My body was a war zone. I wanted to ask, to scream, but I couldn't. I heard the voices again, but they weren't speaking to each other anymore. They were speaking to me. "He's listening. He shouldn't be. It's too late now." I wanted to scream. I wanted to beg them to stop, to let me go. But I couldn't move. I couldn't make a sound. I was a prisoner in my own body, but worse, I was a prisoner to whatever dark secret they were hiding. Then, a final voice spoke, and the words chilled me to my core. "He doesn't know yet. But he will." And that was when I realized something that made my blood run cold. This was no normal surgery. These weren't normal doctors. And whatever happened to me on that table, whatever they had done, it wasn't to save me. It was to use me. I don't know how long I lay there, trapped in that strange half-conscious state. It felt like hours, but in that in-between world, time didn't make sense. I couldn't move, couldn't make a sound, couldn't do anything but listen. I heard the soft shuffle of feet, the quiet hum of the machines, and the rhythmic beeping of the heart monitor. Every small sound felt amplified, filling the void where my voice should have been. But amid the mechanical sounds, I could hear something else. The voices. Still distant, still cold. "He's still breathing," one said, as if checking a list, as if I were nothing more than an object to be accounted for. Another voice, the one I'd heard earlier, spoke again, its tone still as harsh and mechanical as before. "Keep him quiet. We can't afford any complications." My heart skipped a beat. What did they mean? What were they going to do to me? I felt the pressure of hands on my body again, colder than before. Something sharp pressed against my skin. It wasn't a scalpel this time, but something thinner, something more delicate, almost like the touch of a needle. I wanted to scream, to shout, to fight. But I was still trapped in my own body. Nothing responded. Not even my eyes. I couldn't see a damn thing. All I had were my ears. And those voices. "He'll remember everything eventually," one of them whispered. The words were hushed, like they didn't want me to hear. But I did. I caught every syllable. "Let him remember," another voice said, low and steady. "We can't stop now. We've gone too far." My mind raced. Remember what? What did they mean? There was silence again, a terrible, suffocating silence. I could feel the coldness in the room pressing in on me. I couldn't breathe properly, and the weight of my own terror was overwhelming. I wanted to shout, to ask what was happening, but I couldn't. Then, finally, a new voice, one I hadn't heard before, but with a strange familiarity to it. It was quieter than the others, almost mournful. "He doesn't belong here." The words hit me like a punch to the gut. My heart began to race again, thumping in my chest so loud I thought they might hear it. My body stiffened, my mind screaming, trying to break free. But nothing. I was still there, still paralyzed, still a prisoner to whatever was happening to me. "The procedure's finished," the harsh voice said. "We'll have to move him now." I felt them lift me, carefully, mechanically, and I wanted to scream, to tell them I wasn't ready, that I didn't understand, that I didn't want to go anywhere with them. But I couldn't. I could feel the cold metal of the operating table beneath me as they moved me, and the strange, sharp pull in my chest again, as though I were being dragged across the floor, through some dark, empty hallway. I couldn't see. I couldn't hear anything but the sound of my heart pounding, the rush of blood in my ears, and those damn voices that still lingered, floating around me like a terrible, unsolvable puzzle. "We're close," one of the voices said. "He'll be ready soon." I didn't know what they meant. I didn't know what they had done. But the fear, was consuming me now, more than any pain I could imagine. It was something worse than pain. It was the unknown. The terror of not knowing what was happening to me, and knowing that whatever it was far beyond my control. Something was horribly wrong, and I couldn't escape it. Then, the voice from earlier, the one that felt the most familiar, the one that had spoken of remembering, spoke again, but this time I could almost feel its words pressing into my soul. "You'll know the truth soon enough," it said, its tone dark, final. "And when you do, there will be no turning back." I wanted to cry. I wanted to beg them for answers. But all I could do was lie there, helpless, as they moved me to wherever they planned to take me next. And that's when I realized the horrifying truth. This wasn't a hospital. This wasn't even a real operation. They weren't trying to save me. They were using me. And whatever they had planned for me, whatever they were going to do to me next, it was far worse than death. I don't know how long I stayed in that state, half awake, half trapped in a nightmare, but eventually I felt the coldness of the room shift. The sterile metallic scent of the operating theater was gone, replaced by the damp, musty air of an unfamiliar space. I still couldn't move, still couldn't speak. I was a prisoner in my own body, unable to make sense of what was happening. The sounds were different now. The quiet hum of machines had disappeared, and the muffled voices I had been hearing seemed closer. The room felt abandoned, as if it had been forgotten by time. But the voices, those voices, they kept circling around me, like a nightmare that wouldn't end. "We've waited too long," one of the voices murmured. It was deeper now, colder. "He's starting to wake up." "Good," another voice replied, softer but no less chilling. "We'll need him conscious for the next phase. He needs to remember." I felt my body jerk, as if something inside me was trying to fight its way out. I couldn't control it. I couldn't stop it. What do they mean by next phase? What are they going to do to me? For a moment, I thought I heard footsteps. Faint at first, but growing louder, as if someone, no, something, was approaching. My heart skipped in my chest. I wanted to scream, to call out, to warn whoever might be near that I wasn't supposed to be here. But I couldn't. A soft thud. Then the sound of something heavy being dragged across the floor. The whispering stopped. I heard a door creak open, followed by the sound of a voice, too familiar now, calling out my name. "David, Daff." The voice was unmistakable. I didn't recognize the man who had called me. His tone was too calm, too detached, but something about it stirred a deep unease in my chest. There was no warmth in his voice, only coldness, like he was speaking to a machine. "David, you've been dead for a long time." The words echoed in my head like a sickening refrain. I tried to focus, tried to force myself to understand what was happening, but everything felt like a blur. The world around me was a distortion of half-glimpsed images, sounds that didn't quite connect. It was as if I were slipping between two realities, both equally impossible to understand. I wanted to scream. I wanted to tell them that I was alive, that I could hear them, that I was here dash. But my voice wouldn't cooperate. My body was still paralyzed, frozen, trapped in this awful purgatory. The footsteps grew louder again. This time I could feel them. No, not just hear them. I could feel the pressure, the weight, as if someone were walking right beside me. I could hear their breathing now, ragged and uneven. I wasn't alone. There was someone, or something, standing right next to me, close enough to touch. My pulse raced. Was it one of them? Was it the Dr. Dash? The surgeon who had operated on me? The one who hadn't spoken? The one who had been so mechanical? No, I thought, my mind screaming. No, it can't be him. I wanted to open my eyes. I wanted to see, to understand, but I couldn't. I could only lie there, a prisoner to the silence and the fear. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, everything stopped. The footsteps, the breathing, the voices, they all fell silent. The stillness was suffocating. My heart thundered in my chest, as though it were trying to break free from the confines of my body. And that's when I felt it. A cold, clammy hand pressed against my arm, as if trying to reassure me, or maybe just to make sure I was still there. "Please. I need to know what's happening." But all I could do was lie there, consumed by the fear that whatever was happening it wasn't real. It couldn't be. None of this made sense. Time to wake up, the voice whispered again, the same voice I'd heard before. You'll see soon enough. I wanted to fight. I wanted to break free, to run, to escape. But I couldn't. I was still trapped in my body, still helpless, still dead in their eyes. The truth was closing in on me, and I was terrified that when I finally understood it, it would be too late. I don't know how much time had passed, but when I finally woke up, it wasn't what I had expected. There was no bright light, no sense of relief, no return to the world I had once known. Instead, I felt the cold steel of an operating table beneath me again, my body heavy and still unresponsive. My mind, however, was screaming. I was awake, but I couldn't move. I couldn't speak. For a brief moment, I wondered if I was dreaming. Maybe I had never actually left the operating room. Maybe this was all some kind of twisted hallucination. But no, this was real. The sterile scent of the room, the faint hum of machinery, the shadows that danced around me in the low light. All of it felt too real, too alive. I could hear them before I saw them. The same whispering voices, the same cold tones that sent shivers down my spine. I strained to listen, hoping to understand what was going on, what had happened to me. You're still here, one voice said, almost amused. You shouldn't be. You were never meant to wake up. What does that mean? The words made no sense. Why was I here? Why couldn't I move? And why did it feel like the room itself was closing in on me? I tried to make a sound, any sound, but nothing came. It was as if my voice had been stolen from me. The sensation of my throat being closed off, suffocated, only heightened my fear. Then, the figure appeared before me. The same one I had seen before. The same one whose voice haunted my every waking moment. It was him, the surgeon. But this time, it was different. There was something wrong about him. Something wrong about everything. His eyes, cold and empty, stared down at me. His lips barely moved as he spoke. You're lucky, you know. Lucky you didn't die when you should have. I wanted to scream. I wanted to tell him to leave me alone. I wanted to run, to escape, to do anything but lie there, frozen, helpless. But no matter how hard I tried, my body refused to obey. I couldn't do anything but lie there, staring at this man who had somehow become a nightmare incarnate. The truth started to surface in my mind, but I didn't want to believe it. I didn't want to face the horror of it. I knew something had gone wrong during the surgery. I knew now that the man operating on me wasn't a man at all. He was a ghost. He had died years ago. The thought hit me like a truck, and my heart almost stopped. I died on that table. I whispered to myself, the words barely forming in my mind, too terrified to acknowledge them fully. I died. I should have stayed dead. The surgeon, no, the ghost, was now leaning closer. His cold, dead hands hovered over me, and I felt an unnatural chill, like death itself was brushing against my skin. I could see the outline of his body, faint and translucent, but his presence was undeniable. You were never supposed to wake up, he repeated, his voice now just a whisper in the cold, empty room. You weren't meant to see this. But now you know. I tried again to scream, but my body was still paralyzed. Every part of me was locked in place, imprisoned in my own flesh. But the horror, the realization, spread like a disease inside me. I had been dead. I had died during that surgery. And somehow, The surgeon, who was just as dead as I was, had brought me back, if you could even call it back. I wasn't the same. I wasn't alive. And I knew deep in the marrow of my bones, that I was never meant to leave that room, that I had never truly escaped. I was still there, still trapped, in a nightmare with no end. And as I stared into the eyes of the surgeon who wasn't supposed to exist, I understood the terrible truth. I had never left, and I never would.